everyone, and welcome. My name's James Harding. I'm the editor and co-founder of Tortoise. I wanted to just say, before we got started on today's Cyber Summit, a big and warm welcome to you. This is our newsroom. If it looks a little cozy and cafe-like, rest assured that there is what looks like a factory of workstations behind us where a fair few people are going to be working through the course of the day. But this is our newsroom. This is where we try to figure out the stories that we're going to commission, the sense makers that we write and record. Our podcast studio is downstairs. And I say that because the idea of Tortoise was to create an open newsroom. I'd grown up at the FT and the Times and the BBC, and often the most interesting stories had a code name. When there was a really big project, we took the smallest number of people into the room possible to discuss how best to cover it. And our thinking was, could we do it differently? Could we bring everyone into our newsroom and try and, in as organized a possible way as possible, let loose the chaos of the news meeting? Allow people to share their opinions, disagree, have different points of view, and come to a better understanding of the issues that are driving the news together. And cyber, I guess a little bit like Labradoodles and the songs of Bruno Mars, once you notice them, they seem to be everywhere. And cyber feels like one of those issues where we, because I started out in journalism, spent the last 10 years thinking aloud and worrying about the extent to which technology was transforming and twisting the information marketplace. And then you begin to realize it's transforming and to an extent twisting everything, whether it is national security, economics and finance, the ways in which communities and individuals interact with each other. And the aim of today is to try for us as a newsroom to understand not the big events, but the big developments, what's driving those changes and what are the likely outcomes. And I say this as someone who is fascinated and totally amateurish and deeply confused. I can't work out whether or not what we're seeing is a cyber revolution that is, if you like, just a step change in the way in which businesses and organizations operate, or whether it's a fundamental rewiring of our economy and society. And I hope that in the course of the day we'll get a better understanding of that. I feel a little bit like one of those people at sort of a posh function that's actually done nothing but put on a red coat and said, welcome. Shy of the red coat, actually that's pretty much what has happened, because Alexandra Mousavizadeh, who is an editor and partner here and who runs all of our indexes, not least the person who set up our global AI index, has been the convener of this Tortoise Cyber Summit. You'll know some of our colleagues, I hope, in particular, Alexi Mostras and Luke Bedimer, who work on our tech state sense maker and are trying to make sense of what's happening amongst those biggest platforms in tech. But in the course of the day, we hope you will weigh in as much as possible and inform our journalism. So I hope some of you I know have been to a Think-In before, most of you haven't. The one very simple rule that we've got, and we don't really enforce it, but what the hell, it is a rule, is no questions. We want you to come with your points of view, your experience. So tell us what you think, and we hope in the course of the day we'll weave that together, and as I say, come to a better understanding of what's happening in the world of cyber. With that, I will hand over to Alexandra. We've got quite a gang of wise owls who are joining us today, so I look forward to hearing from them. And Alexandra, I look forward to the chance to learning a fair bit and understanding together.
Well, me too. I'm curious. I think I'm mic'd up.
This is a Tortoise branded microphone, so I can take
it. Marion wants it back. Thank you so much, James. This is the first session of the day, and it's my great pleasure to that we're going to be taking a closer look at nation-led cyber attacks, and it's such a pleasure to have such a distinguished three speakers here at Tortoise talking about this topic. And so we're going to kick off with Tom Hurd, former head of UK Homeland Security and led the Joint Biosecurity Centre. And to his left is Nigel Inkster, who served for more than 30 years at MI6 and spent many of these in China and working on China, and is author of China's Cyber Power and now at IISS. And on screen, we have Marietje Schaake, former Dutch MP and member of the European Parliament with the focus on tech policy, and now director of Stanford's Cyber Policy Center. Before we get started, I just want to say, just as James said, please do weigh in with your opinion, either in the chat online. We've got many joining us from around the world. And otherwise, just raise your hand or catch my eye and weigh in with your questions, although we would rather hear your opinions. But the way I think we should, and I'd like to run this, is that we would start looking at the sort of the state actors and start with Tom on Russia, and then go to Nigel on China, and then go to Mariette on sort of the European policy or global policy response. So Tom, if I may start with you and ask you to give us a bit of a scene setting first, sort of a big overview of what's going on, then zoom in on Russia and sort of tell us what you think sort of is the sort of bigger picture, but also particularly on Russia and sort of their role geopolitically, but also sort of through the lens of cyber, of course, what role they're playing.
Scene setting around ransomware, because I think that's the thing that affects most of us, you know, either at work or at home, rather than kind of estimate knowledge online. There are some very frightening figures out there which describe a tsunami of ransomware. Estimates that the ransomware industry costs us all about $6 trillion annually. Now, that might be an overestimation. That would certainly make it more valuable illegal activity than the drugs sort of market. There are reports that there is a ransomware attack somewhere in the world every 11 seconds. And the situation will get worse. Estimates are that ransomware has increased 350% since 2018, and as the kind of what they call the threat surface increases, as more of us work online, more of us plug in more things to the internet, that gives more opportunities for people to attack us. And there are about 100 billion new lines of software code written every year, which again just shows you the kind of explosion of sort of activity online. And there are estimates that there are about 300 billion passwords that need protecting kind of globally. So massive, really until recently, I think, under kind of rehearsed, under researched area in the public domain, but costing us basically a fortune. Now, my concern is that up until now, most ransomware has been effectively a form of fraud. It's attacked the consumer internet, let's say, and it's defrauded people and companies of money. But there are instances, perhaps growing instances, of ransomware now attacking industrial control systems and hospitals. You know, your data in a hospital, your patient data is much more valuable, maybe 50 times more valuable in the black market than your credit card data. So we're seeing attacks on industrial control systems. Now, for me, that means that ransomware can start representing a physical risk to people and not just a kind of a fraud. And I'm sure we'll talk later about kind of what that means in terms of, you know, from my perspective, the gloves needing to come off. So just on Russia, because the Russians really are very good at ransomware. But just to step back about sort of how they look at it kind of strategically. So if you're the Russian elite, your business model is about control at home and sowing uncertainty and division abroad to keep your adversaries off balance. And so their foreign policy playbook is around subterfuge and subversion. It's not around diplomacy and dialogue. And if you talk to some expert like Fiona Hill, who is a very famous Russian expert in the United States, she would say, just look at the elite, look where they came from. They're all kind of spies and hoods. So, you know, they're going to want to use those techniques that they learnt in their careers to project their interests. So the internet for them offers one great risk and one big opportunity as well. So the great risk for them is that they lose control of information in their space. Because rule 101, if you're an autocratic state, is don't lose control of the narrative at home. So that's their absolute priority. The opportunity is that it's very cheap and effective to sow uncertainty and disorder abroad using the internet. And it's worth noting that, and something I've watched throughout my career in security, is the Russians are really good at bending the laws of physics. They do stuff that you just can't go, how did they do that? And Gordon would talk about Havana syndrome or whatever, but how did they do that? And you walk down the corridor and somebody's scratching their head saying, we just don't understand the maths. So, my money is still on the Russians being really good at this, irrespective of what tools come to the market. The other thing that's been very important to understand about the Russians is that they see cyber security as part of a much broader thing called information security. So they don't hive off kind of cybersecurity in a way that we do into a kind of industry and things like that. They see it as a whole, and they want to. They see it really as controlling all forms of information, and so when they think about offensive cyber, they don't think like we do about kind of attacking other people's critical national infrastructure or taking down terrorist networks. They think about misinformation, about poisoning the well of elections, and not just about kind of mounting ransomware attacks or sort of espionage attacks. So, and we see it differently because we believe in the freedom of information. They believe in the freedom of misinformation. So they see it as one. So what are the Russians doing? I think mainly the Russians are trying to split themselves off. I mean, if you look at the kind of things they're doing, they want to create an internet that they can own. So their legislation is all about information sovereignty, putting up the walls, very heavily regulated, actually, the Russian industry around that. Their top priority from a military perspective is they have to build better capabilities to counter information operations in warfare, because they know the Americans have, formidable kind of traditional military kind of offensive cyber capabilities. The Russians are building their own satellite communication systems, but they're still a long way behind where the Americans are. The Russians have maybe 180 odd satellites. The Americans have near 2,000. And they experiment, and then how does it affect us? So at home, they're creating this sort of information security. How does that affect us? So they are trying to get in, they'll try and misinform us. There's lots of information they put into our systems to misinform us, to sow division. They don't really pick sides. They'll just kind of look to exacerbate both extremities in a debate rather than just focus on one. They'll try and interfere in elections. In the military sphere, they kind of experiment. They try their new techniques out, because the best place to kind of hide your experiments is within a conflict. So in Syria or Ukraine, they're trying out new ways of working, seeing what works, so they can sort of add it to their kind of playbook. But I think the main thing that they're not doing is that they're not going after the ransomware gangs that are based in Russia. Now, I would dispel the myth that a ransomware gang is a bunch of kind of scruffy types in trackies in some back room at all. This is an enterprise industry, and it involves a whole ecosystem of people who need to run the infrastructure to carry out ransomware. And the clever technical people are just a very small subset of this kind of industry. So now the Russian state doesn't, I think, control the ransomware gangs. They don't direct their attacks against particular sort of targets on a systematic basis, but they do provide them with a license to operate. And they will, I'm sure, talent spot within those gangs for people who are quite useful, who could work on kind of joint projects together. And I'm pretty certain they're taking a cut of the winnings. So for me, that is fine on one level. I mean, and this would be a debate and an argument about how much kind of risk you're willing to accept on cyber. But, you know, I imagine a scenario where a ransomware gang, kind of drunk on the adrenaline of greed, oversteps the mark. And they take out a hospital and there are 30 people dead because the ventilation units don't work any longer in the ICU. And that's where I think we need to kind of steer the debate. What are you going to do when that happens? Because the playbook we've got at the moment doesn't deal with a situation when you're in Cobra, Prime Minister's there's 30 people dead, it's on the news, the press has already decided who did it, and you go into Cobra, and to be frank, if we presented the playbook that we use at the moment, I'm pretty certain any Prime Minister would say, you need to come back in an hour with a better plan.
Before turning to you, Nigel, just two quick questions, Tom. The robust response is not something that's shared necessarily among, you know, if there's a cyber attack, is there then a physical retaliation on, if you know where they are? I wonder if you could just sort of unpack that a little for us. And then second question, sorry to double question you, but it is, you were in the Situation Room, what you call it here, during the SolarWinds. Now, SolarWinds has been reported, and without asking you to breach the National Secrets Act, maybe if you could try and give us a sense of what you sort of could surface from that you could bring to us today.
I think I have a sort of cathartic moment because I can wrap the two into my sense of frustration. So my background, I mean, you know, having done sort of Homeland Security for 5 years, but basically I was responsible for the counter-terrorism system in the UK. Now, we have a different playbook on counter-terrorism. Because if people put us under physical risk because they're terrorists, we put them under physical risk. It's that simple. And, you know, the reality is that if you're a terrorist abroad and you know you're under physical risk, you are spending quite a lot of your day making sure you get to the end of that day, rather than planning and, you know, walking around and setting up your kind of your startup, ransomware startup. So I know there is a different playbook out there if we wanted to go there. And I imagine if there were 30 dead in a British hospital, we would be asked to look at that playbook and say, what can you bring from that playbook now into this space? Now, I'm not saying that you're going to land a cruise missile on a kind of a data center just north of Moscow, but somebody around the table at Cobra will ask. So you need to know, you need to tell them why you're not going to do that. You need to have planned that. But you know, this is an ecosystem. There are lots of players involved. You would go very hard on the money. Money is a vulnerability. I mean, them getting the money out of the system and into the real world, I think, is a vulnerability for the gang. So you would have to go very hard on the money. But, you know, let's say on terrorism, you know, we have very big terrorism watch lists of anybody involved or assisting in terrorism, which means they can't travel around the world. That's why when you go through an airport, you know, we all enjoy the experience going through kind of the border police, but, you know, that's what they're checking. So, you know, why don't we build a big database of everybody who works for a Russian ransomware gang and make it clear that they'll never travel in the world again? They just won't be allowed in. So, you know, there are, you know, things, but I think you know, what you have to do for me is, if you're in a policy space, is you need to be in pre-mortem world. Think of the worst thing that can happen, and then think how you'd respond to that, and then work back to what you're doing now. So when we had the counter-terrorism attacks in the UK in 2007, you know, we thought we were pretty good at counter-terrorism. We just actually reviewed our strategy. We were literally about to print it. Half a dozen attacks, punch in the face. you go back to the CT community and say, not good enough. Within 3 months, 100 new ideas.
Yeah.
So, I think the cyber community needs to go through that. So, with SolarWinds and other attacks, there is always that real sense of frustration that our response is just so far below, what we're capable of, but also what will actually change behaviors, because that's what will change the incentives of ransomware gangs.
Nigel, if I can turn to you, if I may, and your focus and time spent in China, and also the brilliant book that is here that you've written about China's cyber power. I wonder if you could maybe do the same on China.
Okay, well, yes, thanks very much. Thank you for asking me to come. Just as with Russia, China's primary concern is with securing its own information space, and it was China that coined the concept of cyber sovereignty. But at the same time, China's objectives can be seen as very different from those of Russia. China does not aspire to see an unstable world. What China wants is a stable world, but a stable world, so to speak, with Chinese characteristics. They want to see a world in which the Chinese party state is accepted as legitimate. They want to see a world in which China's core interests are acknowledged and respected, and China is effectively able to exercise the influence it believes it is entitled to do as a major power. So that's the first thing. Though it must be said, and I think this is an important qualification, China, this has led China to, the concern with information security and with cyber sovereignty has led China to focus enormous resources on content control. Literally millions of people and billions of pounds are being spent to make sure that people don't send social media messages comparing Xi Jinping with Winnie the Pooh. But this has come, of course, at the expense of cybersecurity capabilities, where China is very weak. And it's noteworthy that in China, where these things are very much seen as the purview of the state, there is no private cybersecurity sector. There is no Chinese FireEye, CrowdStrike, Mandiant. There are a couple of companies, but very, very limited capabilities. So that is a huge vulnerability where China is concerned, of which they're acutely conscious. And that is, I think, also a very significant factor in their behavior. Secondly, where China has significantly diverged from Russia is in their remarkable capacity to commercialize the skills and knowledge that they have acquired. Nobody in their right mind is going to buy a Russian computer, a Russian operating system, or have a Russian app on their phone. But Chinese computers, Chinese operating systems, Chinese networks even, these are pervasive. And this is where I think China has also very significantly diverged from Russia, because it is using its growing capabilities, not perhaps so much in a lot of original research in foundational science, but in a remarkable ability to adapt existing knowledge to develop capabilities, consumer-facing capabilities that eliminate a lot of the frictions of daily life in urban China. These have been remarkably successful and have given rise to enormous companies that have become household names: Alibaba, Tencent, JD.com. Everybody knows these companies, and of course Huawei. So Huawei is, for reasons I'll come to, undergoing a rather difficult experience at the moment. So you've got this, and it goes beyond that, because China has very clear ambitions to use its economic heft and growing capabilities within the cyber domain to shape quite fundamentally global issues of cyber governance, cyber security, and cyber standards. We see Chinese engineers and scientists swarming the international agenda. we in the UK will send, one person to a particular meeting, Internet Engineering Task Force or something like that. The Chinese will send 20 or 30. And this is, our officials hard pressed. They have to juggle, do I go to this meeting or that meeting? I can't go to both. The Chinese go to all of them. They absolutely cover the territory. And they've shown enormous ambitions and ingenuity. If we look at, particularly using their national champions to create facts on the ground around the world. We see this particularly with the example of Huawei and fifth generation mobile telephony, where we came very close to a situation in which Huawei became the kind of default standard setter for global 5G. The Americans managed late in the day to kneecap Huawei, and with it, China's ambitions in this regard. But if anybody thinks that this is going to stop China from continuing down this route, then they're laboring under serious delusions. Because we see, for example, 2 years ago in the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, Chinese engineers from Huawei turned up with an idea, proposal for a new IP, a fundamental re-engineering of the internet on a top-down government-led basis. We see in international negotiations on cyber governance, China pushing relentlessly for a move away from the so-called multi-stakeholder model of cyber governance towards one that is top-down, government-directed under the aegis of the United Nations. So, and of course, we also see, particularly in the developing world, China rolling out its own networks and systems using the so-called digital Belt and Road. So a lot of countries are being given, well, on very concessional terms, Chinese networks, Chinese systems that help bind them in, and of course bind them in also to the values that underpin those networks, because with these networks come all the capabilities for surveillance and repression that are endemic to the Chinese system. And of course, we've seen in China the evolution of what can only be characterized as a techno-security state. The development of pervasive surveillance networks within China that make it really difficult for people to evade the eyes of the state. A friend and colleague of mine recently wrote a book called A China Coup, in which he imagined Xi Jinping being overthrown by Chinese, by some of his colleagues. This couldn't happen. Surveillance is so pervasive that there would be nowhere where two coup plotters could be confident of meeting and having that initial conversation without being observed and overheard to that state. I would also say that in addition to being a techno-security state, China, I think, has to be considered an intelligence state in much the same way as, say, the Venetian Republic at its apogee in the 15th and 16th centuries, insofar as intelligence, covert collection and covert behavior is kind of hardwired into the fabric of the state in a way that would not be imaginable in an open liberal democracy such as ours. And this is the other thing, of course, that we're seeing about China, and which is, everybody kind of automatically thinks about when thinking about China and cyber, is this pervasive and growing tsunami of cyber operations, primarily targeting intellectual property and technology, which China urgently needs if it's going to achieve its own objectives under Made in China 2025 and all the other long-term ambitious plans that they have for China to become a global technical leader. But it is also the case, of course, that cyber espionage operations have transformed the fortunes of China's intelligence community. Through such operations, they have been able to access quantities of intelligence and information, literally beyond their wildest dreams. And it's gone just beyond information because they were very quicker, I think, than we, to appreciate the significance of bulk data. We now see in China huge digital warehouses, so to speak, that store the captured data of tens, hundreds of millions of Western citizens. Americans in particular, but our data is there as well. And this is kind of there à toute fin utile. It is.
Yeah, if I can ask you a question about that before we go over to Mariette on some of the points that I wanted to pick up on that you mentioned, but on the having and getting hold of all of that information, I think there was one particular case in 2016 where the Chinese were able to access a government body in the US, and that the response by the US was to, in absentia, charge 3 individuals in China. So that was interesting to see that was subsequently there has been more of a sort of please don't do that response. What do you think? What's next in terms of that? Harvesting the data and the US response to that.
Yeah. Well, I think the case you were referring to was the theft of data from the Office of Personnel Management, which contained the data of about 22.5 million federal employees, including a sort of rich treasure trove of targeting data about who's vulnerable because they've had a divorce, they've been using drugs, they've got money worries, et cetera, et cetera. So from a purely counterintelligence perspective, this is a remarkable coup. But I mean, what we're talking about here, and this is where dealing with China is very difficult, is we have an asymmetry of vulnerability here. Put bluntly, there is a lot more China wants to steal from us than we want to steal from China. And that makes responding to these attacks very difficult. The Obama administration in 2015 tried it by sort of naming and shaming, as it were. They identified members of a PLA cyber unit based in Shanghai, photographs, bio, et cetera, et cetera. That had some impact, but we've moved on from that. And I see no evidence that China is shameable anymore. I think of China rather a bit like Millwall United Football Club. Nobody likes us, we don't care. And they don't, because they know basically they are doing this and they are paying no price. And we have not found a way to make them pay sufficient of a price. I mean, I don't want to sound too much like privatized London taxi driver, but this literally is the only language they understand, Gov. And we're not doing it.
With that, I think, can we turn to Mariette on screen? Hi, hello, Mariette. Welcome. Thank you so much. I think you're joining us from a conference in Amsterdam. Is that right?
I'm actually in Athens, but online it's all flat.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you so much for joining us today. Remarkable career, Dutch MP, and been in the European Parliament and following tech issues. And now it's at Stanford Cyber Policy Center. And you had a piece in the FT last month as a reaction to the Putin-Biden summit in June, where there was a off-limits list that you reacted to because the academic institutions hadn't been included. I just wondered if you think, actually to something that Tom said before, that list of 16 targets should be a lot bigger and of course should include the academic institutions. And to Nigel's point, the sharing an academic, Chinese academic engagement around the world is very different from the other way around, I think. So I just wondered if you could give us your thoughts and reflections on that, on the Putin-Biden list, and the sort of policy response that you think should be put forward.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's remarkable to just listen to the other two speakers where the question is, are we ready for cyber war? And what we're talking about is intelligence gathering, the developments of digitization and how it changes relationships within societies. For example, it gives new opportunities to criminals to benefit from a growing attack surface, but also impacts geopolitical relations. And throughout all of this, it's not entirely clear where state-condoned criminal endeavors actually bleed into state confrontations that we might label as war, at least an escalation of conflict that is of serious nature, where governments should attach consequences. And so I think we can see a scrambling of what the best responses are to the escalations of a variety of kinds using digital means. And what was remarkable is that the Biden administration, on the one hand, indeed made it clear to Putin that there are a number of critical infrastructure sectors that the administration considers off limits, and that it doesn't include universities, but also labs and schools, which are increasingly targeted, at least by those cyber criminals, but also by intelligence services if they're looking for, let's say, the ingredients of a vaccine or other worthy information to benefit from. And one of the challenges that I think we see by trying to say these categories are off limits, others then might not be, is that there is a huge ambiguity, a very, very large gray zone that has not been articulated to say these activities are not only off limits sort of politically and diplomatically, but also considered to be illegal according to international law. And because there is such vagueness about where the thresholds really are, where, for example, the methods used for intelligence gathering or the methods used for criminal activities bleed into the thresholds of an intervention that is invading the sovereignty of a nation, or indeed goes into those critical infrastructures in a way that we would never accept if it was not through digital means. Without clarity of what the thresholds are, it's harder to attach consequences, because when has the line been crossed? And I think one of the problems is that responses to intrusions, for example, efforts to intervene in US elections, or otherwise to intervene in critical infrastructure, are also often covert. So from a democratic point of view, from an accountability point of view, and from an advancing of this debate, politically speaking, we're also groping in the dark quite a bit of what is actually happening, not only on the part of states like China and Russia, but also on the part of our own states that are increasingly using offensive capabilities to push back in practice to these criminal and state-led groups. So if you ask me, what we need is a much more defined articulation of where international law is violated, and a clearer set of sanctions and consequences, so that indeed, and I've heard that from both previous speakers, there is a price to be paid. There are clear consequences, and we begin to see that there are not only norms, but also laws that are going to push back against this unacceptable escalation of both criminal and state-led cyber attacks. Whether we call it war or not, below the threshold of war, there is a lot of harm that can be done, and we see this happening every day.
Can I just I just want to, Alexandra, I just want to sort of partly just kick off, because I know that it's slightly new when you're in a newsroom like this to think you really can just weigh in, so please do weigh in. But I wanted to just do one thing which was practical, and one thing which was a problem on our minds. The practical thing is, we just produced a long series of pieces called Finding Q, when you were looking in the West at what was the most interesting, in some ways, perversion of the online information space. QAnon seemed like the most interesting case, and we're now trying to work out what's the cyber equivalent of that. Is that, and this is probably for me and Gordon and all of us trying to figure out what's the story. You mentioned Havana syndrome, Tom, but is it REvil? Is that the one ransomware example? You go, okay, that's the story that kind of opens this world to people. So we're trying to figure that out, and any thoughts on that from anyone here would be really helpful. And I just wanted to say something about, you talked a lot about what is the playbook. You talked about in terms of China, in Russia, all within the context of countering a cyber attack. I read the integrated review. I remember speaking to John Bew. I didn't understand what it meant, and I guess that was the intention. But there is a risk, it seems to me, that the national security community is moving to a new position on cyber as relates to offensive uses of cyber, but without a public mandate for it. And we don't yet know what we think is acceptable in terms of the use of these cyber weapons, and it's not really been explained to us what we think should be done in our name. And I don't know how much of a debate there is going on in that. I haven't heard much of one, so I'd be interested to know what you think on that, Tom.
So on the feature, I think there's a very interesting feature to be written about. At the center of it is a negotiator between the ransomware gangs and the victim. So, and they're, because, somebody has to negotiate between the two. And insurance companies will have these people, most likely they're ex-policemen who have worked in kidnap for ransom cases and understand that kind of negotiation. And I think there's a story that tells the journey of an attack from the perspective of the negotiator. I don't know. Online, there are a lot of them who would like to be famous and would advertise their wares. But I think the negotiator sits and can therefore tell the story between interacting with the ransomware gang, who has a hotline and a customer desk. It's all. They want you to rate you for their services at the end. So this is interactive, and then dealing with the victim as well. So they sit between the two, and I think they're dealing with the insurance company, and I think they would have this interesting perspective. And one negotiator who also had a background in, like negotiating with kidnappers, let's say, would give that interesting kind of perspective. On offensive cyber, I agree. It feels like a shiny thing, and be careful what you wish for, because if you press the button. So we use offensive cyber. I mean, we've used it against ISIL very successfully, and taken down botnets and things like that. But be careful what you wish for, because can you deal with what's coming back? And so I agree very much that there needs to be much more rehearsing, both in the public and the private domain, around the doctrine of offensive cyber. I don't think that's kind of happened. Yes, these are expensive capabilities, and you've had to make a trade-off in making that money available. Personally, I would have put more money into, raising levels of education around cyber kind of in schools. But hey, not my choice.
Do you have?
Yes, Gordon Carrera from the BBC. I think this question about cyber wars is a really interesting one, and are we ready for cyber wars? I'm not sure we'll ever see like a cyber war in the sense of sci-fi. We might see cyber used in a war, but then what we're seeing now is cyber contests going on day to day, and offensive cyber used day to day, where the space is being contested and where people are pushing back at gangs and trying to degrade their capability. And Britain's National Cyber Force is supposedly operating already against criminal gangs and doing things. So it's not as if it fits into that definition of kind of war and peace and the button gets pressed and then they go down, but it's much more of a kind of daily contest is what it can be and what it should be. And it goes back to the kind of problems of definition and what's a cyber attack, and do we even like the term cyber attack? Was SolarWinds a cyber attack? SolarWinds was just espionage. And yes, I thought the American response to it was kind of odd, because they went, this is some massive thing. Actually, it's exactly the kind of espionage the US and UK do. And they just got caught out of it. And to call it an attack and to say it needs some kind of retaliation, well, if you invite that response, then, Russia and China have got a right to respond in similar ways when we do the espionage that we do day to day against them. So we need to be quite careful about what we mean when we talk about attacks and cyber war, I think.
We are very close. We're very few minutes away from the end of the session, but I thought maybe do you just want to do a quick response, and Marietta to the question? Yeah, Nigel, would you want to go? Yeah.
Well, I think on ransomware, it's not an area of my expertise, but I think one area that needs some greater attention is the whole area of cryptocurrencies, which undoubtedly greatly facilitated and incentivized this kind of conduct. I know that China has just banned Bitcoin in its entirety, You know, I mean, I'm not suggesting that that is necessarily the way forward. You know, there may be some, you know, genuine, you know, utility in cryptocurrencies, although the, you know, environmental consequences of mining them is something I regard with concern. But that is, I think, something we need to look at. On Gordon's point, yes, I mean, you know, we don't have it, you know, nobody knows what cyber war is, and nobody knows what a cyber weapon is. And, you know, one goes to endless, you know, meetings and conferences that seek to try and, you know, define these things. And, you know, sort of many years in, we're not really much further forward, quite honestly. And yes, you know, I would simply support what Tom had to say about, you know, offensive cyber operations. Yeah, you do have to think this through very carefully. And as I said, you know, because we're not, you know, we're not dealing with sort of, you know, an equality of interest. There is this sort of big asymmetry of vulnerability which we need, you know, to factor in. And I think, you know, sometimes the mere facts of an attack itself understandably generates indignation and an understandable desire to retaliate. But I think we need to look far more carefully at what the real damage is. And to my mind, the key question is, how repairable is this? And, you know, what more can we do to enhance the resilience of our networks? Because, you know, in many ways, I think that is going to be our best defense. You know, networks will go down. How quickly can we get them up and running again?
I think Gordon's point and the one made earlier, I mean, definition sounds like a dry subject, but it's actually really important. And you do need to define what critical national infrastructure is. And, you know, as the point was made earlier, because I think that's changing. You know, in a knowledge economy, your critical national infrastructure is your IP increasingly. It's not just your kind of your water and your electricity. So you have to redefine what it is. You then have to define your red lines. So what would be interesting in the conversation, I'm sure there was a second part of the conversation with Putin. So it's here's the 16 that are off limits. Personally, it should have been 1600, but because you know he's going to come out of that, he's going to go, well, I'm going to push the envelope because I want to know where the red line is. So the second part of the conversation would be, well, if you do go after these, X will happen. Now that's not in the press, but I'm hoping that they did have that second part of the conversation. So there's a definitional point there, definition around doctrine. And then, you know, there's a really important thing about definition around standards. You know, the great heroes, I think, in cybersecurity are not going to be the companies, to be frank, bless them, they do serve their purpose, who are selling you products today, okay? The people who are going to set the definitions that really matter are the people who own the internet, the physics of the internet, the big companies, the telecoms providers, things like that. And their thinking is much more interesting, frankly, than some of the stuff we see on social media from the people who are selling us stuff. And it's people like the National Institute for Standards and Technology in the States who are showing up to Nigel's meetings, but they will define what is good software and what is not bad software. And it's these areas that need more kind of voice and more air, I think, in the debate, which I feel is being drowned out by somebody selling you, frankly, snake oil.
Right. And I think, I mean, just a question of, and I know we've got to wrap up because I'm over time, but, and I'd love to just get Marietta's response to this, but as there's a whole separate conversation about the role of the big tech companies, the people who own the pipelines of data, as you said earlier, and all the sort of operators, and what are we asking them to do, and what responsibility, and how do we hold them to account on this? Marietta, if you've got, if you're still there, want to weigh in on, and one last comment before we close.
Yeah. Well, I think that is the story. James just asked about, you know, what is the one story to look at, and I think it is the fact that we have essentially outsourced our national security in the whole digital realm to companies that have different incentives, different aims, profit, innovation, good reputation, then protecting the homeland, then creating that resilience, then investing in, for example, protecting the hospitals that they sell software to. So I think liability and accountability throughout the system, and rebalancing the role between the private sector and democratic governments is crucial to get to a solution here, and to get more clarity on who has which legitimate role to play and what needs to be done to protect the public from these varieties of attacks without being lured into a kind of tit for tat that indeed is not always winnable or does not lead to an improvement for the people that we should care about.
Thank you, Marietje. Thank you, Nigel. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, everyone, for joining here in the room and online. The chat has been absolutely fascinating. I'm so sorry I couldn't go to anyone online. I wish I could have. We had time. It is. This will be available for everyone after the fact. And I just wanted to give a huge round of applause to our speakers. We will do closing remarks at the end of the day. We're going to try and wrap it all up into what we've heard and what we think about what we've heard. But a huge round of applause to Marietta, to Nigel, and to Tom. Thank you so much.